Welcome to the Equip Podcast. Here you'll find conversations from people of all different walks of life, sharing their experiences, the things the Lord has taught them, and things to equip you. Equip is based on Ephesians 4:11-13 that talks about equipping God's people for works of service so that the body of Christ may be built up. That is our goal here, to build you up and equip you through seasons of ups and downs in life. Welcome back to the Equip Podcast. I'm your host, Taylor Gibson, and today I'm joined by Mandy Jentes. Mandy was one of our Cultivate breakout leaders, and I have asked her to join us today to share about her breakout session at Cultivate. In that breakout session, Mandy got to share about when God's answer is no or not yet, and how she has seen that play out in her own life. So welcome, Mandy.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
So glad you're here. Well, will you start by giving us an overview of your story and some of the things that God has had you waiting on?
Absolutely. When I was a teenager, I was a live-in nanny in the summers. And in general, in my hometown, I was the go-to babysitter.
That's a good gig.
It's a good gig. I mean, it was housing and fun summers, a tiptoeing into independence. And most of my friends and family always saw me as the mothering figure. They always say, you're going to be an incredible mother. I started practicing when I was 14, living with babies. And I met my now husband when I was in my 30s. It was a little bit of a delayed time to meet my husband, and it was a whirlwind romance. We walked down the aisle within 6 months of meeting. But one part that was strange to most is on our second date, and I have his permission to share this. Okay. On our second date, he said, I don't want to make you nervous about how serious I'm being, but you deserve my transparency that I'm aware of a medical condition which may impact our ability to have kids. He said, you deserve to know that before we potentially get too close. If that's a deal breaker for you, I understand. I said, well, oddly enough, I've always had a passion for adoption. If you're open to building a family that way, and if that's the Lord's plan, I'm good. He said he was good. And that was the first glimmer of God's provision and blessing that I can now see. Because that was God's way of saying, your plan for family might be different than what you expected, but he packaged it, wrapped up in puppies and rainbows and starstruck with romance. So that was a good way of having a soft entry into a different path. And after we were married, we went through the normal path that many families do when they have infertility. And then we pursued adoption with the plan of private adoption, baby. And as we pursued that, our hearts became more softened and aware of the need for foster care. So we became licensed to be foster parents, still with the hope of adoption. And to summarize 6-8 years in there, we went from the plan of adoption to fostering to adopt to realizing that God may have a plan for us to just be that family that is a soft place to land for a season. And through that, we became passionately broken for the biological parents behind that. So that has led us to now serving biological parents and helping families restore, which is the opposite of my original plan of having my own family. Instead, our mission field is helping restore other families. And that's great. And now I can stand here 10 years later saying I have such fulfilling joy in that path, but it did take 10 years to get there. And it was about a year or two ago that I realized I was done with the game, the pretend game with myself of saying, I'm fine, everything's fine. It's tricky when I was maybe suppressing how much grief I was actually working through, because in a way I wanted to shield my husband from that. But in a way, our Christian culture is to be happy with whatever God puts in our path. And that needed to be dealt with at some point. I found myself questioning my faith. I resented the path I was on. It was very triggering to be around families with babies. So it began this unearthing, this spring cleaning of my heart.
Mm-hmm.
And that's kind of what brought us to the meat of my breakout session in Cultivate.
Yeah. So, and that we may not be able to go into all of this, but how did you begin to deal with and process that?
It helped by having friends around me say, you're not okay when you say you're okay.
Mm-hmm.
And that touches a little bit on kind of the toolbox of how do you get to the other side of it. The people around you, that's got to be a critical choice,
mm-hmm.
an intentional choice of people who can see you beyond the smile of your face and say, I know there's something behind that, and it's going to continue to be there unless you face it head on.
Mm-hmm. That's good. Well, there's a verse that you mentioned in your breakout session, Psalm 37:4. Can you share the verse and share how that's really played into your story?
Absolutely. Psalms 37:4 says, take delight in the Lord, and he will give you the desires of your heart. And that's the NIV version. And that verse has historically been taken out of context for generations, not just with the Christian community, but the non-Christian community. Of God says he's going to give you what you want and what you ask for or what you pray for.
Mm-hmm.
And a common misinterpretation, and even how I subconsciously interpreted it for years, was essentially that if I'm in good standing with God, then I'm going to get what I want. And it's because we get hung up on that second half of the verse.
Mm-hmm.
We're really fixated on he will give you the desires of your heart, which can turn God into like a genie with a lamp or an ATM. We begin having a transactional relationship with God of if then. And I found myself doing that. And we can become consumed with what is the quote unquote desires of our heart. And that can be different for a lot of people. For me, I'm a visual person. And about a year ago, God just put this visual in my mind of the desires of my heart being almost like in a treasure chest. Mm-hmm. And if that treasure chest were at the bottom of a lake or an ocean, that's what my heart was anchored to. Like if I represented a sailboat trying to travel through the water, I was still anchored at the bottom to this treasure chest of what was the desires of my heart. Mm. For different people can be different things. And I like to invite people to take inventory of their own heart. What is taking up real estate in your heart? Mm-hmm. When you lay your head on your pillow at night, what is the thing that you're thinking of? And the most difficult part about this is many times they're God-honoring things that further the kingdom of God, but there are plans and are specifics. Mm-hmm. And I mean, while we're recording this at this stage of your life, I think about things that you might be thinking of. Mm-hmm. Praying for a healthy baby, praying for complication-free birth. Those are noble, God-honoring things to pray for. And that's the difficult thing to reconcile when we are praying for specifics. And if that ends up not being what's on God's path. And other things I think of is there are the women out there that are just young women or widowed women, you name it, who are praying for the boyfriend or the spouse. Mm-hmm. Medical healing in their own life or others. The people that are walking through the dark valley of cancer. Mm-hmm. Even simple as a better job or financial stability. There's so many simple things that we take to the foot of the cross and say, okay, God, what's your plan with this? Mm-hmm. And when we find ourselves in this difficult path where God has us waiting indefinitely, or it even becomes clear of God saying, that's not my plan for you. That's the reconciliation that takes time to work through. Mm. And as I started to unpack Psalms 37:4, it started to shed so much powerful light on what that verse actually means. And it does reconcile that conflict. Because the word to take delight in the Lord, I always process that as taking as receiving, like I'm going to take this gift. But when you break down the meaning behind that, take is an action word. It is for us to pursue him, reach out and take it. Mm. And it is a participation word, not passive. That was a first trigger for me that I'm on the wrong path with this verse. And when it says to take delight in the Lord, the Hebrew meaning for delight is enjoyment, pleasure. At the heart of it, it means fulfillment. So it's saying, reach out, seek, and take fulfillment in the Lord. That's the first half of the verse that a lot of us skip over. And when you understand that, pursue it, and find a place of being able to live it, the second half of the verse resolves itself. Because when we are taking and seeking out and accomplishing fulfillment in the Lord alone, the desires of our heart are met, because what we ultimately desire behind the specifics is a feeling of fulfillment.
And it's Him.
Yep. And we think that XYZ item will be what scratches that itch of fulfillment in our life. That's what's going to bring us joy. We think we know ourselves better than the Lord knows us.
Yeah, the one who created us. It's fine.
Absolutely. But in time, when I found myself truly experiencing being in the folds of His presence and His plan, regardless of what was happening, I'm like, wow, this feels delightful. This feels fulfilling. It satiates that thing that we keep holding on to. Because at the heart of it, the actual meaning of that verse, to take delight in the Lord and He will give you the desires of your heart, truly, it means that when we seek after God to be our source of fulfillment, the desires of our heart, the specifics fade.
Yeah, that's really good. So how do we yield our personal desires to God's bigger plan?
Isn't that the $1 million question? Well, a couple years ago, when I started facing kind of this inner conflict, I began reading really light reading. I began reading Experiencing God by Henry Blackaby.
Oh, yeah. Super light, just casual.
Yep. And I think that I'm on the 5-year plan with that book because I'll read a chapter and I'll have to put it down, absorb it, find a way to apply that in my life, and then I'll be ready to move on. And when I was in the deepest part of grief that I hadn't even really acknowledged or recognized, when I was the deepest part of it, I was reading the chapter and it hit me like a ton of bricks, where he said, if you ask the wrong questions, you're always going to get the wrong answers. And so often we ask, what is God's plan for my life? And we're asking this very microscopic question, when really our job as Christians, as followers of Jesus, is to back that out to a larger view of just saying, what is God's plan? Period. From a worldview, from a kingdom view, what is God's plan? And then once you start to identify that, you can ask, what's my role in that? And that helps us be much more flexible with the specifics. And I'm learning that our personal growth, it rarely happens within our comfort zone. So if we're expecting to grow and change and improve, we need to be ready to get uncomfortable. And the classic analogy is found in Isaiah 64:8. It says, we are the clay and you are our potter. We are the work of your hand. And in the breakout session, I gave a visual of a lump of clay. And when we hear that, it's easy for us to jump to that old classic scene from the movie Ghost when they're, sitting at the ceramics wheel and making this beautiful vase. And that's not actually the majority of what happens with a potter and the clay. And the very beginning process of it, and I had the pleasure of taking ceramics when I was in college, the first part is called wedging. And it is taking that lump of clay and kneading it like you're kneading bread dough. You are working it. You're squeezing out all the air bubbles. You are creating uniform material throughout it, meaning no corner or trace of that clay is left undealt with. You're preparing it so that there's no flaws or impurities in it. Because if you don't do that stage of working it and kneading it, it can fall apart when it goes to the kiln to be fired. And the other part of it is centering the clay. Once you properly wedged it and prepared it and worked it, and you are cutting it open in the middle to check the progress. And there are moments in my life when I felt cut open into the middle to kind of see, where are we at? Have you given me full access to your heart? And once that stage is done, the clay is thrown onto the wheel. Slammed onto the wheel. And that's such an analogy for us just being thrown against the foundation of God and adhered to Him as our foundation. but you're rarely put dead center right away. And to properly create something, that clay has to be centered. And the way it happens is immense pressure from the sides and from the top. You're pushing in and pressing down, pushing in and pressing down, yielding that clay to the center, dead center. For me, that has been friends in my life that have held me accountable to my hurt and said, I see that you keep fighting against something. I was not allowing myself to be yielded to the Lord. Scripture, prayer, all those things keep getting us centered on His plan and His will. Once we're finally able to do that, I picture that almost as like God rolling up His sleeves saying, okay, now we can get to work and create this beautiful plan that I have for you. But the biggest step for me in being yielding and letting the potter work with me was facing and giving myself permission to have anger and despair. And if anybody listens to Jenny Allen, she has a great podcast. And that's another moment for me that hit me like a ton of bricks, because she said, God can handle our anger. He can handle our despair. And up until that point, I kept saying I was fine because I felt like that was God honoring. A great analogy, picture a mother with a teenager. And that teenager wants to, say, go to prom. Going to prom is life for that teenager at that season of her life. But let's say that mother knows something that is not in that child's best interest, and she needs to shield and block that from happening. So if that mother takes away prom, there's two paths in that relationship. That teen can get angry, slam the door, shut her mother out, and just be avoidant. Total disconnection. Or that teen can come to that mother with despair, maybe even a little bit of sassiness and disrespect, and say, I don't understand. Can you help me see what you see? Because I can't see it. And when we take our despair to the foot of the cross like that, to say, God, help me see what you see because I don't understand. It's in that moment for me that my intimacy in my relationship with God hit a new level, because I finally was saying, I want to hurt with you and I want to understand, and I just want to see what you see.
Well, and it's truly giving all of yourself to the Lord, not just you can have these pieces, but I'm keeping these pieces.
Absolutely. And for me, it was in that moment of owning and recognizing my deepest despair that the journey could move forward. It was clear that I was trapped in this cycle of stubbornness until then. And when we talk about wanting to be in the presence of the Lord, that is it a lot of times as well. The presence of the Lord can be with Him. And Matthew 5:4 says, blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. And I think about what Carrie Gillen said during Cultivate, where she said she felt the most intimate in her relationship with God during the trenches of her, journey with cancer. And she said, if cancer was taken away from me and that cost me some of this intimacy, then don't touch this. I need this intimacy with the Lord. And learning that mourning and despair can bring us some of the most beautiful intimacy with God.
So how do we find full joy and fulfillment in the Lord?
Well, as odd as it sounds and as conflicting as it sounds, sometimes that joy can be experienced in the intimacy of inviting the Lord into that despair and into that confusion and then that hurt. Also, for me personally, and I hope that it can be the same for others, even though I kept holding on to those desires in my heart, I was anchored to what I had in that treasure chest. I was not letting the Lord lead my life. If you picture Him like the wind in the sails of a sailboat trying to lead this boat to where He has planned, I was unwilling to let Him take me where He had planned, because I just had this foothold on what I wanted. And when I was willing to cut that anchor free and say, I can't even see where you're trying to lead me, but I'm going to take this leap of faith and trust that it might be better than what I had planned. That's when the goodness of the Lord really started to shine through. And we didn't sit idle during that 10-year journey. It wasn't that we just sat and just waited and said, God's going to give us kids, so we're just going to sit till it happens. We still pursued foster care. We still pursued other ministry opportunities. That was our way of peeking through different doors. As they opened up, we look in there and say, God, is this what you have planned for us? Is this? And that allowed us to, my husband and I both, because we get to do this together, that allowed me to start realizing that this gift and talent that he had instilled in me at a very, very young age of just mothering and motherhood nurturing, he had planned to use that in such extraordinary, unique ways that I'd never imagined, and I would have never exposed myself to or allowed myself to be in if I had stayed stubborn. And my gifts and my talents feel used in a way now that I could have never, ever imagined. Now, is it the same joy? Is it the same fulfillment? No. Like, it's different, but it's different in a way of, I know that God had a plan to use me in a way that a lot of other people in the world might not be willing or capable of doing, and that I feel used to my fullness. And it scratches that itch of wanting to feel used, because when we feel a fullness of joy, it's because all those special talents and gifts that God has instilled in us, we feel like they're not going to waste. And I had this fear of, if I don't have kids, then this desire and gift of motherhood will go to waste. But it's been the opposite. He said, no, hold on, because I need to use that gift in an extraordinary way. The irony, and I feel like the Lord has quite a sense of humor.
Oh, yeah.
If you really step back and look at it, he had instilled in me, I can confidently say now, he instilled in me a way to help guide and coach and teach other mothers, but I don't have any kids of my own. And so there is some irony there that I get to walk alongside parents and families. And when we desire to have a family instead, we help rebuild other families. We can laugh about it now, but the other beautiful thing that we get to experience that very few other families do, our family is built by choice. And there's no legal obligation. There's no biological obligation. Those kids choose us and we choose them, because now a lot of them are young adults and there's still this mutual admiration for each other, and we get to choose each other. That's a beauty that a lot of people don't get to experience, and learning that those gifts are different than what we'd expected. We set our minds on what gifts we expect. We say, God, this is the gift I'm asking for. Give it to me. And we can shield our eyes to seeing all the different gifts that he has been planting around us, like experiencing this unique parenting. And I love that Leanne Kirkendall, she referenced Psalm 16:11 when she was our keynote speaker, because that was a verse that I referenced in my breakout session. It says, you show me the path for life. Being in your presence brings the fullness of joy and pleasures that last forever. And that's it. At the end of the day, is what we're all chasing after, is that fulfillment and that joy that lasts forever, when really it is accomplished by being in the presence of the Lord. But you do that by surrendering our plans to him, by being open and inviting the Lord in when we have those moments of despair, and knowing and realizing that sometimes he knows what's best for us more than we do, even in difficult things that are hard to reconcile. I mean, look at it. Job never got his wife and kids back. He was restored, as the scripture says, but he didn't necessarily get his wife and kids back.
Well, he kept his wife the whole time, but his kids.
Right. Yeah. Absolutely. So there's some loss and there's some sacrifice there that didn't actually come back, but God's sovereignty was shown through that. So there are going to be times that we find fulfillment and joy, even though there is loss and there is sacrifice. And for me and for others, it's still going to hurt. You can heal and still hurt at times, but there's a difference now where if there's something that hurts, I can look at it, I can wave at it and say, okay, I see you. That pulls something up, but I can move through it. I'm not pitching a tent and camping out in that hurt anymore.
Well, and I think it's a sweet encouragement too, that the Lord is not going to gift you with something that he's not planning to use.
Absolutely.
So he may not have used your gifts of nurturing and motherhood and that kind of thing the way you thought he would, but he got to use it in such a cool way that you never could have guessed that.
Absolutely.
And I think a lot of times we spend time and camp out in the guesswork of, well, how's the Lord going to use this? And what do I get to do with this? And I want it to be like this. When really he's just saying, delight in me. Mm-hmm. Come find your fulfillment in me, your fulfillment. And so I think that's a really sweet encouragement for anyone listening, no matter what stage of that season or progress you may find yourself in.
I gave an analogy of, it's easy for us these days to create a DoorDash order for God of, I can see these gifts and talents, so I'd like you to use it this way, this way, this way. And then we get confused why he didn't fulfill our DoorDash order. But remembering that he's not going to give us a gift to waste it. And there's not going to be a hurt that is allowed in our life that's going to be returned void. All of our hurts and losses will serve a purpose if we allow them to serve a purpose. And learning that we may not get to see that if then. It will serve a purpose that we may not get to see on this side of heaven. God's timeline, when you look at Scripture, God's timeline is often functioning in generations, not months and years. And we're looking for quick resolve and quick reconciliation of this conflict, but knowing that it will serve a purpose and my gifts will be used for a purpose if I'm fully surrendered to his plan and not my DoorDash order.
That is a message that keeps coming up in different areas of my life and our Connect group and Bible study and all the places of God's timeline is not my timeline, which as we're recording this, I'm in my potentially last month of pregnancy. It won't, by the time it airs, I'll have a child, hopefully. But it's kind of this season of could be tomorrow, could be another month. And it's just a nice reminder that the Lord has been so kind to keep bringing this message up of you're going to have to wait on me. And you don't get to know the exact day or the hour when this baby's going to come. And so I think that's one of the cool things is you waited 10 years processing through some of these things to see how the Lord was going to use these gifts that he'd given you. We can't force a timeline. We can't say, okay, well, I'm going to be married by the time I'm 25. I'm going to have kids by the time I'm 30. I'm going to have the job I love by the time I'm 40. Whatever. We can't force that because the Lord's plan is different. There's a verse in, I think it's Isaiah, I'll find it and link it, that says, your ways are not my ways and your thoughts are not my thoughts. And so reminding ourselves of that.
When we go back to that analogy of the clay, we can shortcut things. We can speed it up and keep it on our own agenda. But if we don't allow ourselves to be fully prepared and fully centered, the ultimate creation and plan that the potter has is compromised. So we get to choose, are we going to force our timeline and force our plan? We may be robbing ourselves of an even greater beauty in our lives that we cannot see. When we cut that anchor loose to our lives and let the Lord lead us outside of our line of sight, it leads to more beautiful things that our minds could not comprehend. We have to be willing to let go first to get there.
Man, it's good. I hope that this episode has been encouraging to our listeners, especially those that maybe have been in a waiting season for a while and are growing weary, that our encouragement to you is just to lean in. Our prayer for you is to lean in. Mandy, before we go, we have 2 questions we ask every guest. What is something you're learning and what is something you're loving?
What I'm learning kind of touches on what we talked about today because this has just been my heart recently, but I'm learning to be less stubborn with God's timeline.
That's good.
And learning that his timing and his solutions are not always what I expect. The way that plays out in my life is I'm learning to pray. Instead of saying, God, here's my desires, I'm saying, God, help me want what you want. And in specific, like for my own journey, when I knew that birthing babies naturally was not going to happen, then I said, Lord, have mercy on me and release me of that desire to have babies. Would you at least have mercy on me so that I can want what you want?
Yeah.
And that's a big deal to say, if this isn't your plan, then will you at least release me of these desires?
That's good. And what are you loving?
I love bonus grandkids.
I saw your post about that the other day.
Yep. I love bonus grandkids. When we have stepped into this unique lane of having, we fostered older teens. And with that, as they become young adults, they go on and have kids themselves. And the fact that we get to do life together by choice, that means we get to do life with grandkids. And that's another area where God had a sense of humor, where I wanted to experience babies. We had the joy and honor of fostering a teen when she was 36 weeks pregnant. I got to be in the delivery room when that baby was born. I held that baby when she was 5 minutes old. And we're now 3 years in of doing life with her. We went to a kindergarten, Cinco de Mayo performance the other night and took our little kindergartner out to dinner. Tonight, our 3-year-old baby that I held in the delivery room, she's coming over for dinner. So we get to experience all that beauty of grandparenting without the work of parenting. So it's been a pretty beautiful thing.
It gives me chills just thinking about how kind the Lord is in that. It's very sweet.
He gave us the cherry on top.
Yes. Well, Mandy, thank you for being here and just sharing your heart, sharing what the Lord has been working on in your life these last 10 years. And I hope that this is helpful for our listeners.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to the Equip podcast. Be sure to subscribe to be the first to know when a new episode drops. And follow us on social media to stay connected. We're at GABC_women. See you next time.